worry about that. Okay, so let's begin with this. If you guys could tell me a bit about yourselves, like starting with you, Christopher. From what I understand, that you have been working remotely and as a freelance product manager for a while now, right? So if you could just tell me a bit about yourself, the kind of work you've been doing and how it's been going remote, right? Or being remote, like how different has it been? Because product is such a nodal role, right? You kind of need to be at both places. So how do you handle it?
Yeah, so I started working remotely in 2013, I would say, or 2012 even. First in 2012 on a nonprofit initiative where we were just a distributed team across 4+ countries. And then in my own startup afterwards, again, we were a distributed team. So it was always part on-site and part remote at that point. Working with, we had an office in Chile that we used as part of Startup Chile with most of our team members there, but we also had team members in Lesotho, one in Ivory Coast, etc. And then after I closed my first company, Stereo Me, in 2015, and I started freelancing, I joined Gigster, which was in Y Combinator at the time, at a very early stage of their freelancing network, as a product manager on the platform, and that was full remote. So that was really my first entry into the full remote company, remote freelancing world, 2015 in the summer. And since then, over the last 5 years, I've been, well, almost exclusively remote. I had an agency of my own for a while. It was called homies.io. We ran it between 2017 and 19. And at the peak, we had 25 consultants. And for that, again, it was a blended approach, but I personally was full remote. So I was paying for a WeWork office space at the time of the company, which I, in retrospect, regret. To be honest, I could have saved a whole lot of money on that. It was very expensive. But the people in Austin, they told me like, oh, we feel we might be a bit more productive if we have a dedicated office space, you know, for us as a small team to work, because we were taking quite a few interns as well from the university there. And that is one caveat that I would mention. Like if you're taking in a lot of interns, there might be a good use case for an office space, unless you have like a really robust setup for remote interning, which we didn't have at the time.
Okay.
But you know, normally you would work remotely most easily with people that have experience working remotely or have experience in their craft, because you can really rely on them to get the job done asynchronously, versus having to teach them a whole lot of stuff, right, remotely, which is just another skill set. It's harder to do potentially. So yeah, the majority of the last 5 years, personally remote. Teams I've managed have been remote. Most of those teams have had senior contributors. So I haven't worked too much with very junior members remotely. Again, mentioning that as a caveat. But yeah, it's ask me anything about it. I personally love it. I wouldn't really want to go back to a full office job. So whenever I look at new roles, like I'm often open to going on site for a bit, but you know, not full on site. That's yeah.
All right. And coming to you, Luke. So Hotjar has been a huge proponent of, you know, running remote teams and how having the flexibility of wherever your employees want to work for, and on the company side, the flexibility of hire wherever you want to work for. So could you tell me a bit about yourself and how have things been at Hotjar?
So I've been a product manager at Hotjar for 2 years now. I've been leading teams. As you said, it's a 100% remote company. So we're spread over. We're mostly spread like in the European time zones, so like and the American time zones. Yeah, and most of the engineers. Well, let's say all of the engineers are located in the European time zone. So obviously, fully remote, but in
still the same time,
more or less, plus minus 2 hours exactly. So yeah, and as you said, we've been a fully remote company. I think one of the most important, and also I think Christopher touched on this. Mostly, we look at people who really want to work remote, who not necessarily have had the experience, because obviously, like, not all companies offer fully remote, but it is a different. We've seen that it does require a different mindset from the people who will be working remote, and so our hiring strategy, our onboarding experience is all tailored to making sure that there is a fit, and we make sure that we bring in people who would fit in this kind of environment.
Got it. So we'll be covering that later in this session where we talk about that. How do you hire for remote, right? On one side, Christopher, that how do you kind of go ahead and talk to clients, or rather talk to people who you're going to be working with from the other side, and look from your side that how from the company side you evaluate product managers remotely, right? We'll cover that part later. That's a very interesting angle to this whole thing. But let's kind of begin with this, right? That that the whole world went into lockdown in a staggered manner at different times throughout the course of this crisis. And I'd like to know both of your first reaction as people who have been remote or have experienced remote from the very beginning. That what did you see happening? What did you guys feel? And so, yeah, let's start with you, Christopher. That you've been remote for the past 5 years, largely, right, with on-site for a couple of days. So, what was your reaction when this whole thing hit and lockdowns hit, and a lot of people who were on-site, working on-site before, were forced to kind of move to a remote setting?
Yeah, I mean, so suddenly remote is not so much of a niche topic anymore. So I think that's really great. I do think that there is a bit more pressure on traditional remote workers to almost professionalize their setup, right? Like previously, having a laptop and headphones might be enough. My biggest investments last year, last year's was a standing desk, which I mainly did for my own ergonomics. But otherwise, it was all up to you. And now the bar is being raised a little bit, but that's also good, I think, across the industry, right? Like, because we can really then make remote working exactly like an office in a sense, from a quality perspective for those people that were traditionally more skeptical. But I think the biggest change for me from a work perspective is rather on the client side. You referenced that as well, talking to clients, for example. I'm not worried about the long term of remote work. I think the trend was already that more jobs were going remote, and that's only being accelerated. However, in the shorter term, running into a recession is a reality. Companies are not necessarily, some are cash strapped, others are holding on to cash because they are afraid of, there's a lot of uncertainty and volatility in the market. So they are more rate sensitive on the one hand, right? So I'm still in the professional services industry, right? As a freelance product manager with TopTal, for example. So companies are potentially more rate sensitive. They are also looking at how can we potentially postpone projects, because there's always this delay between being able to lay off full-time employees and then being, would you hire new full-time employees, or would you then go contracting? I think you'll first see a bit of a postponement of projects. Then once companies have realized the fixed capacity they need for the next phase of this recession, you'll likely actually see an uptick again in the amount of contracting, because then companies feel like, okay, it's actually, we're more flexible now if we hire contractors than if we hire full-timers. But there is that sort of interim period, which we're in right now, in which work is potentially a little bit more scarce.
Out there. All right. And what about you, Luke? How was the energy at Hotjar when all these lockdowns got announced, or was it all like business as usual for you guys?
So to be very honest, it was like a bit of business as usual. In fact, it took a bit of a while for us to realize that actually things are changing.
Okay.
Well, I say it took a while, but maybe a couple of additional weeks. It was easy. Like, it was more difficult for us to register how much life has changed for a lot of people out there. So obviously understandable, right? I would say, yeah, I think it did take a while to sort of kick in.
Okay.
I think in terms of, we've definitely seen a lot of people ask us about like how we operate remotely and all that, and I think what sort of worries me in this whole thing is, I obviously really like the fact that more people are experiencing with remotes, like, and I do think that life after this crisis will change. People will understand that, will be more understanding of how, of the benefits of being remote. What does scare me a bit is that you can't export an office sort of way of working in by just placing people at home and continue doing the exact same things you were doing before. It does require a bit of a different mindset. And my worry is not the mindset itself, but there is obviously, as Chris said, it's going to be a bit of a negative impact, low morale, and if then things or the traditional ways employees, you are at home, you're not speaking to a lot of people, thoughts start going, start running in employees' heads, and people who are working remotely. So it's very important, I think, that in this period of going remote, companies also understand that there are things that before maybe would have come second nature, but now they need a bit more thought. The way you communicate, how you communicate, how often you communicate, and these things. So
yeah, just one thing to add actually is
No.
that there are a few instances, right, in which, for example, clients of mine were not used to working remote. Now they are remote and they don't really have a setup for it, right? So they're suddenly at their in-laws' house with bad internet or bad spaces, or, for example, myself as well. I'm in a relationship, right? And I used to work remotely, but my partner did not. And now we're both working remotely. But our apartment is not really the size that you would get for two people working remotely, right? So there are a lot of those kinds of struggles that you're in right now. And the danger is, and this goes also a little bit to what Luke said, the danger is if people see the inconveniences in the current scenario as related to remote working, when it's really related to preparedness to remote working. So after this, they might say, oh, remote working was not good. It didn't work for us. I tried it, right? And you kind of might see more resistance to change, a little bit like an example of a traditional industry where you see this is plumbing, right? For 20 years, plumbers were saying no to electrical solutions because they tried it in the 80s and it didn't work in the 80s. And they were just so scared of moving. And people might now say, oh, we tried remote work in 2020 and it didn't work for us. Let's try it again with better conditions, right? Like, let's be prepared this time.
I think that's a really great point, because a lot of people, that's exactly the fear what both of you mentioned, like Luke and Christopher, is that people are judging remote work by the current condition, but these are not normal times, right? Like remote work, like you mentioned, you used to pay for a WeWork office, you could go out. There's this macro doom and gloom going around the place where if you kind of walk out of your house, you're kind of logged in, and that's a very different emotion of remote work. Like you mentioned, having a partner and them working remotely with you. So having two separate professional spaces where you can take calls from, all of those, I'm assuming you wouldn't have those before, right? And imagine people who have children, and those children are also at home now. You don't have school or daycare or anything to kind of, keep them occupied while you're working. So working and parenting at the same time. And these are things that not just product managers, but professionals across the world are facing these issues, right? Which is where it's a great opportunity for a lot of ed tech companies, a lot of media companies to kind of come and offload some of that parenting overhead of these professionals so that they can work seamlessly. And now coming to the specifics, like Luke mentioned, right? Like the specific of the work that goes into remote work or product management. Now, product management is such a central role to any development process, from collaborating with business heads to design to engineering to QA to marketing and growth. You are kind of bored. You're kind of in the middle with all of these things. And collaboration is, if not collaboration, communication is probably 50% of the job, if not more, right? So how do you see product management as a remote position, right? Like when you have multiple stakeholders, it's not a technically an individual contributor role. It's not that. You have a design team to manage, an engineering team to manage, and a lot of other teams to manage out there. So how do you kind of tackle this, right? Like especially you, Christopher, because you are actually entering an entirely different company, right? Looking at this whole thing and then working with their engineers, if not, or engineers they've hired. So how do you kind of see product management as going remote? What are the key challenges and how do you think you have overcome them?
Yeah, so for me, there are several use cases, right? So several different setups. One setup is where I would, for example, be hired by a company as part of a larger team of freelancers that is hired from the same platform, in this case, TopTal, for example. And in such a case, there are, of course, still individual contracts between, like there's a separate contract for the developer and for myself with the client, right? But there isn't really the same culture shift or adaptation process that has to happen, because both myself and the developers or designers would come in new to the client. And so we can either establish a new process with the client or follow their existing process. Most of the time it is adapting a new process, because oftentimes their existing processes are not geared towards remote work. Which is a nice opportunity, because we can actually sort of educate the client in remote first ways of working. So one example is last year, I was working with Sci5, and specifically I was working with Sci5 as part of a new business unit that they started. So Sci5 as a larger organization is not a remote first organization, but this business unit was remote first. It was the first experiment they ran in that field. And yeah, we were able to set up best practices completely fresh. What you mentioned where it gets difficult is if you really have to integrate with multiple different stakeholders with their own processes. So there's another client which I won't name specifically, but they are not a remote company. I of course am a remote player, but then the developers they hired from a third-party agency elsewhere in Europe. And here you're working with 3 companies. The agency is also not remote first, but they are used to working with remote clients. And now these developers are remote, of course, from their homes, because they couldn't be in the agency office. And so then, of course, you start to have rather complex layers of adaptation. I think, as a product manager, it is your responsibility and an opportunity, right, to coach your team through that. If we have to get into the nitty gritty, a lot of it doesn't change. So you have Google Docs, for example, to keep your documentation. You could also use other tools, Notion, or there's so many tools out there. But I often just use Google Docs and Google Sheets for a lot of the central documentation keeping. We have a Slack channel for instant team messaging. You make sure that you have your channel set up the right way, and you don't overload people with messages. And you do daily stand-ups, or if daily isn't necessary, you do them slightly less frequently. And you run Scrum. You can run Scrum the same way you always do. You can run it more formally, less formally, depending on the situation. Yeah, I think a lot of it doesn't actually change that much, especially for me, because I don't have to switch from having done it on site to having done it remotely. And adaptation is pretty quick.
Got it. All right. The next one's for Luke. So Luke, in your sense, one of the biggest hardships that at least I've seen remote companies face is that how do you build accountability and transparency where you can't inherently see the other people working, right? And both of these factors, accountability and transparency, become key when you're consistently working with the same team, right, over and over again. That has this person done the thing I'd asked them to do, or are things going the way that I want? Because in remote work, you can't have that passive conversation in the hallway or in the balcony over a coffee break or a water cooler conversation. So how do you kind of optimize for that at Hotjar, right? Accountability and transparency in a remote setting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, I think the most important thing is in this conversation is going to be like trust. Like I think a lot of people like that inherently, especially when you're working with teams, it's very easy to think to think in a way like, okay, is the person doing the work? Is he being like efficient? Especially if you're coming from an office environment, right? Is the person like giving his 100%? Like, am I seeing him on his laptop? Is she constantly on the laptop? What about distractions? And I think the number one, the key thing in a remote setup, especially if I'm going to be talking from a company perspective, right? Chris's experience might be different because he's a freelancer. But what I've seen is that you need to trust people, and you need to let go of this constant fear that people are not going to be giving their utmost. I think this is something that, rather than optimizing for once you're running the company, it's more the responsibility of the people who are hiring to make sure that that they really hire people who are a fit with the organization and people who they think they can trust. We can talk about hiring a bit later, but I think this is what I want to focus on is if and also there's a second way of looking at it as well. Like if someone is not performing, you're gonna realize, right? And if you're going to try and spot the people who are not performing by looking at the micro, by making micro adjustments, like really looking at micromanaging basically, you're not like, if you take a step back, look at things how they've gone in the past month, in the past quarter, you're gonna get your answer. Like, are people delivering what we want them to deliver over a period of time? Everyone gets their off days, and especially like now in this period where people are adapting to the remote way of life, I am 100% sure that everyone is getting their days where they get very little done because of all the other distractions. But does that mean that that person won't make up for it? So if you're looking at, if you're micromanaging on a day by day basis, an hour by hour basis, you're just going to be feeding this spiral of not trusting people, because the reality is that's life, right? So instead, what we look for is we look at the macro level. Listen, how, are we achieving our goals, objectives that we set in the beginning of the month, in the of the quarter, etc. So I would.
You're
Can
muted,
you hear me?
Neil.
Yeah, I think my internet connection is a bit unstable, but yeah, that's why. Anyway, so okay, that's great, Luke. And so Christopher interestingly mentioned, tools that he used. You mentioned Notion, you mentioned Google Docs. Luke, for you, which are the three tools which you would call are indispensable? It could be software, it could be product, it could be a product suite. Doesn't matter. So, what are the things that you use?
Right. So I think you asked what are the three tools that are really indispensable for me, right? So I would, number one is communications, a method of communications, right? And pretty much we use Jira, like project management. It's central to like a product manager role. And Google Docs, right? So I think those remain the top three, but some really interesting tools that might not be needed in an office environment, but or maybe in large organizations, but are definitely required for remote, uh, not directly related to product management, but like feedback system, like employee feedback, is another tool that comes to mind that normally is not used as much. Other things like software to use to run ideation sessions. I use Miro, for example, as like a whiteboarding software. These are some of the tools that maybe are, they won't make it in the top three, but they're still like super important for a remote team.
You're muted
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. So,
Neil,
what about you, Christopher? You mentioned Notion and Google Docs, right? Are there any others that you use?
Yeah, you keep switching on mute. But no, so in terms of the other tools, I used to be a big Sketch user, Sketch plus InVision. Nowadays, I'm using I think you're frozen, Niels. I'm not sure. So yeah, in freehand, even though it's quite a minimal tool, I like it a lot because it
Yeah, I'm so sorry for that, guys. Can you guys hear me now?
yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think connection's a bit spotty here, but yeah, even I have a couple of people working remotely with me at this house, so yeah, the sharing bandwidth. Anyway, so sorry for that, Christopher. Please continue your top three tools.
Figma. I'm using that more and more to collaborate with designers in real time. And then InVision Freehand, I often use that to create very basic wireframes because it cuts down on the amount of time I need to create wireframes when compared to Sketch or Figma. And those are very rough wireframes, right? That a designer just knows enough, so that they know enough about the user experience so they can create slightly higher fidelity wireframes. It's more time efficient than for me to do that, from 0 to 1. And I mean, Zoom is one I use a lot, but I suppose you hear that pretty often.
Yeah, of course.
I've been a Zoom subscriber for a couple of years now.
All right.
So I used to always tell people about this new tool, Zoom, and now everyone's using Zoom. So
yeah, you were cool before Zoom got cool, right? So yeah, all right. So okay, let's move on to the next one, and this is something that's come up a lot these days, right? Like, how do you kind of hire remotely, especially for product management, right? And because a lot of people like the whole, that I need to meet this person face to face, not to lose out on tonality or anything of that sort. And I know a lot of companies who wouldn't imagine hiring someone remotely, like just over a call or a Zoom call or with an assignment. So, Luke, if you could tell me that, what is Hotjar's process of kind of hiring, right? How do you guys kind of go about doing that?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I think hiring is one of the things at Hotjar that we really focus on. And we at the start of the process, it does not really differ much than the traditional process. You apply, put in your cover letter, a few questions, to first get a bit of understanding of the experience of the applicant, and then that's followed by a couple of interviews. Like generally, the director who's looking at whether he thinks or she thinks there's a fit in the candidate, or I would rather say there's a potential fit. But the crucial part of the hiring process is the last stage, which we call the task stage. Basically, at this stage, we give a 2-week access for the person to. Basically, we'll connect him to our Slack. We'll give him access to whatever information he or she needs, and we just give a task, like a task. If we're hiring for a product manager, we give a product management task. If a product designer, we give a product designer task. And these tasks are, things that one, we actually use to further improve our product. But secondly, it's in the hiring process, you're getting the person to actually work with the team. So during this time, the people who will be working with this person are actually looking at his or her interactions with the team, whether there are any red flags that are being raised. Also, you're judging like the quality of work that person can deliver. But most importantly, I would say, like, from this stage, we learn a lot on whether the person is a good fit. So and things like, for example, we give feedback is constant during this stage, from feedback from feedback from peers. So how do they which way do they react? How often do they collaborate, etc. These are things that show you whether the person will be a good fit or not. And we give 2 weeks access, a task that we take we think takes 3 full days of effort. We do pay people to do the task as well, so there's you're not just doing the task the sake, but you're also getting paid for it. So I think that is the crucial bit. And the way we would approach it, the way we normally approach it, is by the 2 interview stages, you will get an idea of what the person is capable of doing, right? Of what is how good or she will be in the role. fit in terms of culture. And also, nice. That's good to hear. He actually lives not far away from me as well. So
Neil's back, so we're
it's
back
a
on the
small
recording.
world. Yeah.
It's a very small world, yeah.
Once again, yeah, I really need to fix
Um,
my internet now, I guess. So, yeah, but there's no one gonna come and fix my internet now because like it's all shut. So here we are. Anyway, so thanks for that, Luke. That made a lot of sense, right? Like not much changes towards the beginning of the process where there's a short list or everything. But there's heavy focus on, that how do they fit into our process and work of remote work? Because in an office setting, I think there's a lot of overhead we add on to that someone will just fix it. You can just talk to someone and figure it out. But in remote work, you kind of need to be sure that this person can fit into what you're doing because there's not someone standing right beside your desk or just a room away to ask. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Christopher, from the other end, right? Like when you're pitching to clients, but you're remote, you can't. I'm sure in some cases you would go meet them in person and do it. But given that this was a completely remote setting where you were pitching to them, how would you go about doing that?
I'm sorry, Neil,
Yeah, did you?
you're breaking up quite a bit. Could you repeat that, or
So,
just type me the question
no,
in the
sure,
chat,
sure.
and then I'll.
What I was coming to was that Luke talked about how is it from the company's end, like when you hire remotely, right?
Hmm.
I'm talking about that when you pitch to clients remotely, where you don't have the option of kind of visiting the office or meeting them in person. What changes there? How has that been for you? Did you get this one? Like, could you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm hearing it. Yeah, I would say one important thing to mention is that when I work for TopTal, I don't pitch clients from a company perspective, right? So the client comes to TopTal and they say, I need a
Hmm.
product manager to do this role, or I need a team to help me, achieve this goal. And then there's a need established for a product manager. And of course, I would interview with the client to make sure there's a fit between me and the client. They want to have me work on their product, but there's not so much me pitching them to do some kind of intervention or some kind of work activity. It's really just you establish a remote working relationship, which is temporary in
Hmm.
nature. Slightly more temporary than a full-time job, but ultimately everything in the world is temporary.
Yeah.
So I think that distinction is a bit too arbitrary in a legal sense as well, but that's my personal opinion. I think full-time employment versus contracting. Full-time employees are given way too many benefits compared to contractors. Oftentimes we are an afterthought of the economy because we're harder to manage for governments, which is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, so
All right.
no, so as I was saying, like when I had my own agency, we were pitching clients, but oftentimes that was much more on a defined intervention kind of model, right? Where our client a specific app build, so we would first sell them, pitch them on a discovery sprint where we really refined a fixed price project that we could execute, and then we would do more of a waterfall development, or we would say time and materials based. Let's start this contract, in which case your pitch is much more based on your competencies, right? Your qualifications. If it's a fixed price engagement, of course you pitch based on your qualifications, and sometimes there's some things that help you with that, like a reference that you get or a referral. But you pitch for the discovery sprint, but then the discovery sprint work product is really what the client evaluates when they decide, should we execute on this next phase, and should we do it with you? Because ultimately that was always a no strings attached work product that we would deliver, right? So they could always go to another agency to do the next phase of the engagement. Now, yeah, and in terms of hiring, because you didn't really ask me that, but you asked that to Luke. TopTal also, of course, hires product managers in a sense where we let people onto the platform. And in many ways, it's similar. We also have a multi-stage process where it starts with, in our case, an English screening, because we want to make sure that everyone has a professional level of English proficiency to be on the platform. Then there's an automated test that just tests basic principles so that we know, okay, people know the difference between, agile and waterfall work methods, for example. Then there are 2 interviews with actual product managers that are practicing on the platform. And they include things like role-playing exercises, test assignments, questions about your background. And ultimately, if you have, it's about 2 hours of interviews with, let's say, 15 to 20 hours worth of assignments. if you both have work product from someone and you have two different screeners talk to someone for an hour, you have a fair sense of a person's background, right? Like, are they bullshitting me? It doesn't happen often, but sometimes it could happen, right? But if you have video calls, especially, you have a pretty similar amount of body language to being in the room with someone. Okay, you don't necessarily see if they're sweating or something, or you don't see if their legs are twitching like crazy, but is it that important? I don't think so, right? Like, you can get a lot of context from a video call, and that work product is also, it's not only getting a work product, but it's also asking them to present that work product to you. So you get, again, a lot of context there. How does a person present? How would they talk to a client, right? That's a big thing you test for. How can a person, deliver a certain amount of work within a short time frame, right? We give people 7 days to turn around the assignment. And of course, it's not 7 days of full time, so technically you have plenty of hours, but still, it's quite a bit of work to do in 7 days, on top of whatever other commitments you might have at that point in time. And yeah, so I don't see a big problem with hiring remotely at all, I would say.
So from what both of you mentioned, it's kind of psychological in nature. It's nothing to do with process or tools or a change in, it's just a change in psyche that it's pretty much the same. Like Christopher mentioned that, you can kind of replicate a similar energy to having someone in the room with a video call. And Luke went on and said that the process remains the same. In the end, the task is what kind of matters, because getting the right mindset is important, right? When you're hiring and while the person being hired is also on the same page. So coming to that same energy, right? Like you mentioned that a video call kind of replicates that. One of the biggest, challenges that individual product managers have seen face is that how do we kind of replicate, like I think Luke mentioned Miro, right? That what you use for whiteboarding sessions, and Christopher, you mentioned using Figma for faster collaboration with designers. Both of this go towards that. How do you create very fast or speedy collaboration at the ideation level, right? It could be at a wireframing level, it could be at a process level, it could be at drawing the software design itself. And that's one of the biggest challenges, because having everyone in a room with a whiteboard is very different than doing it remotely, where you face challenges like these, right? Like my video is getting cut off, someone didn't catch what you just said, and all of those factors kind of have to play into. So how do you guys run brainstorming sessions, right? Like starting with you, Christopher, how do you kind of go about doing that? Like or just product ideation?
Yeah, so I tend to run brainstorming sessions mostly with clients early on, but sometimes also with the rest of the team. It really depends on how much room does a client have in terms of budget for discovery and ideation. Sometimes they're much more execution focused, right? They say, okay, we've already done a lot of research, and sometimes that's really, they were doing research not necessarily in a structured manner, which a product manager would do, a good product manager would do for you. Or with you. But anyway, so sometimes they say, no, just build this. I know people want this in the market. I've already tested it or whatever. And sometimes that goes well, but sometimes it doesn't, right? I would say it's a very risky approach. And it's kind of like stock picking. Unless you're a real professional investor, you're taking a big risk. And professional investors also take big risks, right? But anyways, they at least have a slightly better chance of success. So on the other level, what you do is, as we discussed, you have video calls. You sometimes asynchronously write down your assumptions. Like, for example, based on our conversation, I would write down a first draft of a product requirements document. I would create some wireframes based on what my understanding is. I would maybe create a first version of a database model. So I can kind of show you how I think the different objects relate to each other. And then I would send that to you. You would comment on it potentially asynchronously, but we also have a call about it. So I can answer any questions you have about it. And oftentimes in calls, you do get a little bit more than just asking you, hey, can you comment on this asynchronously, right? Because you can dig a little bit deeper. There's a bit more freedom and flexibility in talking about it. If I want to do things synchronously, sometimes I get on an InVision freehand and I synchronously draw with them. The one thing with those kinds of tools, though, I would mention is that unless people are used to using them, you're often, as the person who knows how to use them, leading that conversation. Whereas with a whiteboard, everyone knows how to pick up a pen and just start drawing. Not everyone necessarily knows how do I use InVision freehand. And even if they know, like you teach them, actually, there's only like 4 keys that you have to use. It's super simple. they might feel a little bit hesitant initially, like, oh, can I just do that? Like, am I going to break something? Then again, if you're experienced in leading these kinds of conversations, the same way you would facilitate, say, a Google design sprint, you can still get really good results as the person that kind of leads and coaches a client through that. Yeah.
The tools themselves have their own learning curve, if not like, just with the, just the process in itself.
You're muted.
Yeah.
You're muted.
Yeah. So coming to you, Luke, like, how do you run brainstorming sessions or, product whiteboarding sessions at Hotjar?
Yeah. So I think what we try to do is Chris also touched on this. You need to think about the ideation sessions and in a bit of and the brainstorming sessions in like a two-stage process. One, the first stage is leading up to the actual session, so you need to make sure like that you've got all of the data in the right place. So sure, if you granted you also doing it in person, right? But getting the data that you're going to use as your baseline to start ideating on top of, and sharing it with the team up front and saying, hey, this is what we'll be working on, and then also like starting like giving some examples. So start a Google Doc, give some examples of, this is what we're thinking of on the lines of this, here are some ideas that we've already worked on, but this, we're now going to start ideating. This is an ideation session, and the purpose, it's important to highlight the purpose of this ideation session. Is this a session, are we highlighting that you're in the divergence, still in the divergence phase of the design sprint. So making sure, I would say, like clarifying on why this brainstorming session is happening, what are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to solve is key. And I generally like to start taking async ideas. I really love the the commenting functionality on Google Docs is probably like the best thing that's in Google Docs itself, because when it's the document and the document itself, the writing will start triggering questions, and people can just put in those questions there and then. So that's the first stage, and then following up on that by having like an async session. Generally, I also like to use Trello. So for example, if we're talking just about ideas, right, we're talking about the divergence phase still. I generally like to use Trello, prepare the board with sort of the ideas and like group them in different groups, and then maybe having a bit of a discussion around those ideas to clarify any questions there might be. And also from those discussions, you start extracting new ideas that might actually be better than the ones that have been written asynchronously. So it's a mix of async and synchronously. Obviously, like I found that different teams work in different ways. So it is also important to keep in mind that the approach should be different based on what the teams like to use.
Yeah. Luke, you mentioned remote sprints, right? You mentioned sprints, and there's a divergent phase, and then there's a brainstorming session, and then there's an execution phase, right? And when we talk about whatever people call it, it could be a sprint, it could be a cycle, or whatever is it. Once you kind of decided that, okay, this is what we are building, this is how we are building, this is who we are building it for. How do we kind of go about running the sprint, right? Because the traditional agile sprint requires and depends on how you kind of implement it, right? It has stand-ups, it has a lot of different processes laid in, which kind of cater to the office rather than a remote setting, or at least how I've seen companies implement it. They are much better at being run in an office than a remote setting. So the basic question, and this goes to both of you, any one of you can pick it up first, is that how do you run product or design sprints remotely? What are things that have worked out for you? What are things are the biggest challenges? What do you think will not work for sure, right? So let's start with that. Let's start with you, Luke, again, and we can move to Christopher next.
Yeah, so interestingly, like one of the challenges that you'll find is, there's always a bit of imposter syndrome in people working remote. Well, in everyone, right? But when working remote, it's very easy to uptime, for example, to justify what, that you were actually working yesterday and that you're being productive. So I think this is one of these small challenges that I find, that's and but other than that, I would say it's a normal, instead of having a stand-up call, it's going into Zoom or Meet or whatever video conferencing software you have. One thing that I would encourage videos on, because you are actually talking to people, you're seeing the way they're interacting, etc. But other than that, it's not majorly different. I would say, and I would say the important piece is, before you start executing, what's really important is communication. You really need to, from your point of view, from a point of view of product manager, you might feel like you're over communicating, but I can't, emphasize enough how clear and constant communication about not just what we're doing, what is going to happen, but also why. Especially if there are a lot of people, who really like to be engaged in the discussions around the why. You really need to outline the why, and you need to make sure that people understand what you're trying to achieve, and that they end up they believe in it as well, as much as you do. So but other than that, then in the execution stage, like to run a sprint, I would say normal stand-ups, we also do like a retro time. So we use a Trello board instead of being in a room. There's just a Trello board with a list of what's been good, what was good this week, what was bad this week, what have we learned, etc. To spice it up a bit, we normally say, like, for example, give people 10 minutes to add cards to the board, of what happened during the past week. And we say, like, every week we choose a song, just so as a background song while people write, and then it's sort of a discussion as you would have in a normal office environment. So yeah, grooming sessions. If you look at the sprint grooming sessions, there is a risk here that they might go a bit off track, especially well, I might be stretching that this is a remote problem only. I think this happens everywhere, but I think in a remote environment, you need to make sure that basically there is someone in the room who is really, who really keeps the conversation on what is important. Obviously, the PM would be running the grooming session, so the PM needs to make sure that this, everything is clear, what we're trying to achieve, what we'll be discussing. As soon as we diverge, I think it's important that, people understand that we need to converge back to where we were, and uh, saying, like, hey guys, we're diverging away, it's perfectly acceptable thing to do. You're not being rude. It's just, you need to make sure that you maintain, you achieve the goal of the session, basically. So I'd say not much changes.
Got it. All right. On to you, Christopher. Like, how has your experience in running remote products slash design sprints? Because that would become a core part of one of the product manager's responsibilities, working as a freelance or a contract product manager. So, what are the challenges you face? What has worked? What hasn't worked?
Yeah, so I would say, like, one of the challenges and differences that I would see from being in a full-time team, right, where you could run it even as freelancers, you could be full-time as a product manager with a full-time development design team, working over a longer period of time for one client, which makes it very much akin to regular remote work. But once you get into slightly more fractional engagements, right, where the PM is maybe working 5 to 10 hours a week on a client, and managing potentially full-time dev and design resources, you're looking at a scenario in which there's just less time for formal agile process. there's a little bit less time for backlog grooming. There's a little bit less time for estimation sessions. There's a little bit less time for sessions with different stakeholders on the team to ensure that everyone is meeting their personal development goals. For example, feedback sessions, one-on-ones. So at that point, you're doing product work is very important to make sure that the product roadmap stays on track, that what you're developing is really something that customers desire, right? And that you're doing it in a way that is also cost effective. But otherwise, you're running a slightly leaner agile process, which, to be honest, like I prefer the full-time scenario, right? Where you feel as a product manager that you really can invest all the time necessary into your team and the products that you're running. But when you're working on an MVP, similar maybe to if you're working with some buddies and you're moonlighting next to your full-time jobs, you have less time available. You can definitely make things happen with fractional time as well. And you can make good things happen, right? It's just a different approach to running a team. Yeah.
Got it. All right. So this was great. Thanks for this, guys. And an ending note, like we have roughly crossed like an hour mark on the webinar. We usually don't do something longer than this because it's kind of hard for people to digest so much. And there's been amazing information and insights from both of you coming through on this, which will be super helpful. On an ending note, if the both of you could share that as a message to anyone, any product team, any product manager, any company going remote, that what would be your key piece of advice to them going through this crisis, right? Like, I'll give you some context. In India, in the next couple of hours, we might have our lockdown extended beyond the 21-day lockdown that we've had. And of course, the companies have to keep their employees working from home unless you are an essential work or an essential service. So what would be your message to these companies, how to either the individual or the company owners or whoever it is? Like, starting with you, Luke, why don't you go first?
Yep. So I think I'll reiterate my message on, especially on communication, making sure that there is open and honest communication on what is happening at the moment. Where if especially it's going to create a lot of friction, not just in this period, but also employees as I'm not recording. So, Neil, do we still have you?
Yeah, you do.
I don't think we do.
I think not.
Oh, his audio is not connected and we're not recording.
Yeah, we are recording.
Hi, Neil?
Yeah. We are.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we are. So yeah, please go ahead, Luke. So sorry about that.
Cool. So, yeah, I will and I would say that would be the number one. Once you're being open and honest with your employees, and you've outlined in a very clear manner sort of what people should be, what the team should be achieving, what are we all working towards at this stage. If you do that, like, things will start falling into place on their own. People will start finding new ways of working. People are smart, right? We all hire very smart people, so everyone will start figuring it out slowly. But the important piece to me is communication and being open and honest with your employees.
Got you, Luke. And what about you, Christopher? What would be your message to individuals or companies who are going remote now, whether by their own choice or by a macro condition out there? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think it's important to be compassionate in this time. So, it was touched upon earlier as well during the interview, but there will be times when people might at last moment have to miss a meeting, right? Because of some urgent situation, or they might have a really down day. We see this as well with applications sometimes where people last minute ask like, hey, can I shift this, more so than they previously would do. And we just have to be understanding in this time. People might be less productive. People might have more sort of unforeseen things come up, but we'll get through it, right? And as a company as well, if you look at velocity, your velocity might go down. I would say I would personally be surprised if your velocity doesn't go slightly down during this period, right? It would be you'd be quite lucky. But over the long term, if you can get through this, that also builds, on multiple levels, it builds a lot of loyalty. So one, as a company, if you can actually keep your employees on staff, maybe with a bit of less productivity on your employees' part, but you'll really have built some solidarity with your employees, and they'll remember you for that. And on the other level as well, society will remember you as a company that was good to its employees during that time. So I think it's really an opportunity for companies to show their compassionate nature, to show that they're not only operating for their shareholders, but for other stakeholders as well, right? Which previously was kind of the benefit corp sort of impact company mandate or mission. But I think now it's an opportunity for more companies to adopt that and to evolve to a more sustainable economy. So.
Yeah, great. So I think one of the strongest themes throughout this whole thing, that whether you're a product team, whether you're a startup, whether you're an enterprise, it doesn't really matter. It's most important to be human during this time, right? We've talked about a lot of the process, a lot of the functional stuff we can do as a product team to go remote and make the transition or the working of it much simpler. But I think, Christopher, you hit the mark on that one. And that's easier said than done, right? Because when you have the pressure of having a larger runway, when you have the pressure of, not for some companies as against others, right? Because Hotjars kind of always function as a remote team. So like you mentioned, for the first 3-4 weeks, it seemed like business as usual. It took some time for it to sink in. But for a lot of companies across the world, this has been a shock, right? Not only as a macro condition, as the markets and recession hitting, but more along the lines that how do we kind of function with a team of 70, 100, or even 5 remotely. But I think there's plenty of insight here which should ease them into it, especially in India with the lockdown, the new lockdown getting announced sometimes in the next 1 week, right? So, thank you so much, guys. And so sorry for all the issues with the video, but, we'll kind of fix that with the editing part of things as much as we can. And I'll be sharing that with the two of you, sometime this week or next week, as soon as my video editing person gets done with it. So is there anything else that you guys would like to add or anything of that sort? No, nothing, right?
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great day. Stay safe. Stay home. Okay. Great.
You too.
Stay
Take
positive.
care, everyone. Yeah, stay positive. We get through this. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.